Dear listeners, welcome back. It's the History on Drugs podcast. I'm your host, Isaac Campos, and I'm back with a great episode for you today. This one with John O'Connor, the author of A Short, Strange Trip, an untold story of magic mushrooms, madness, and the search for the meaning of life in the Amazon. John is also the author of The Secret History of Bigfoot, which came out, a year and a half ago or so. And John was actually on the show back when that book was coming out or had just come out. I can't remember the order of events, which makes him actually the first ever two-time guest on History on Drugs. But here he is. Now, that previous interview we actually did remotely. I think it was the last one I ever did remotely because I realized I don't want to do remote interviews anymore. Not because the interview went poorly, but just because it's a pain in the ass, and it's not the same. It's not the same to be Zooming as it is to sit in the same room with somebody and have a conversation. So I was looking forward to doing this again, and this time about a new book, about new subject matter, though we should talk a bit about psychedelics, quite a bit actually in the last one. But in this one we talk lots more. A Short, Strange Trip is about the great psychedelic guru Terence McKenna of the 70s, 80s, 90s, until he died at the turn of the century, the turn of the millennium. And it's another great read from John O'Connor. He's a great writer, and this is another great book. Now, John is also, if you didn't listen to that first episode, John is also one of my oldest friends. We go back to at least first grade, maybe kindergarten too. I'm not sure. I can't really remember, but we go way, way back. We've been hanging out for many, many years. We still hang out regularly. And in high school, we regularly hung out and took psychedelics together, smoked weed and, did all sorts of things. So we actually talked quite a bit about that in this episode because John writes a bit about it in the book. And so I probe his memory for stories that I remembered, like getting chased by a maniac in Chicago, a baseball bat wielding maniac in Chicago while we were on LSD. This is a true story. I think you're going to enjoy this one, as I said. Before I turn to the interview, really quickly, we are really up and running on social media, especially Instagram and YouTube. We may spread our wings into other venues soon. But if you check out our feed on Instagram or YouTube, you will find some delightful shorts that are getting put up there by my new social media guy. And he's putting up some great stuff, little shorts from earlier podcast episodes if you want to get a little taste of those and learn about episodes that you might want to go back and listen to. Check us out on Instagram and YouTube. Just look for History on Drugs on those platforms and you should find us there. Otherwise, please just like and subscribe to the podcast, download, and all that stuff. All right. With that, why don't we turn now to my conversation with John O'Connor? I think you're going to enjoy it. In your apartment, and I just read your book, your new book. It's awesome. I didn't say anything when I came back last night because I didn't want to spoil it. I want to talk about it now. I was wondering if you were sitting there wondering
you hurt my
what
feelings.
I thought about it.
Yeah. No, I was stewing about it all night. Yeah.
Well, I spent the day yesterday at the Great Widener Library, one of my favorite places in the world, and finished your book. I'd read about half of it before I got here, and then read the second half. It's another great book. Great read.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. I really, really enjoyed it.
Before we begin, this just occurred to me. Does this make me a gold jacket guest? Has anyone else ever been on twice?
No, you're the first ever. But
okay.
it only half counts because the first time it was remote. And that helped convince me that I don't want to do remote interviews. That no fault of your own, but it's just such a pain in the ass.
And wasn't actually strike two? Didn't we do a previous one also?
Yeah, we
right?
did. So actually, it's the third time I've talked to you. The first time it was a sonic disaster. That was before I'd actually done any episodes at all. I was just trying to figure out if I could do remote.
Yeah.
So you were my guinea pig for that.
Guinea pig, yeah.
And the way I did it didn't work at all. And then I figured out how to do it and did a couple, including the one we did.
Mm.
But it just kind of sucks. I don't like doing Zoom.
Yeah.
I won't even attend a Zoom anything unless I have to for work.
Yeah.
Or even if if I'm going to attend like a lecture online, it's got to be something that I'm really, really interested in, or else I'm just not doing it.
Yeah.
I can't stand Zoom anything.
Yeah.
So,
Well, the professional podcasters, they always seem to have someone in the studio, doing remote is every once in a while someone like Sam Harris will do a remote and the audio just sucks,
Oh, yeah.
He doesn't really do those much anymore, but I will say, I have to say I just want to commend you the professional quality of your podcast, because so many of these podcasts that even like Rogan, if you listen to Rogan, his podcast, the audio is fine, but they'll like cut out like mid sentence, someone will be talking and then they'll to go to like a commercial for some like vitamin supplement, and then they'll come back and they won't even pick up where they left off. It's weird. He just doesn't.
Well, I mean, when you're cranking out 3 hours of content a day or whatever, it's hard for your editors to keep up. And so thanks, I appreciate that. But that's why mine only comes out
it
once
might
a month.
even have been my wife said that it sounds professionally done. Yeah. Like it seems like you do have an editor, but you do, but that editor is also you.
Me. Yeah. Yeah, indeed. Well, all right. So I got a bunch of stuff I want to talk about. I don't want to go blow by blow through the book, but maybe you can give a quick summary for the audience of what this book is about, and then we can move from there.
Sure. Yes, I would say kind of pseudo biography, I guess, of Terence McKenna, a forgotten or overlooked, maybe not totally forgotten in the psychedelic underground, but a forgotten guru of the psychedelic 60s and 70s, who I claim played a kind of major role in getting us to our current psychedelic moment, in particular by evangelizing kind of endlessly for 30 years about psilocybin mushrooms. It's also a travel book. Most of my books are kind of framed as travel books that take a look at oddball, kind of marginal subcultures. I did my first book on Bigfoot. This is about not just about Terence, about the whole kind of quote unquote psychonaut culture generally. I went to talk to a lot of psychonauts, a lot of people who, some of them very sane and sober folks, some of them not so much.
Can you tell the audience who are psychonauts?
People who, let's say, explore the outer reaches of the mind, use and of experience, I suppose, using psychedelic drugs. Yeah, it's a term that I think originated in the late 60s, early 70s, but didn't really come online or enter sort of wider use until pretty recently. Yeah. It was a term that Terence and his ilk threw around a little bit, but not so much. So I called them that a few times in the book, but they wouldn't have really referred to themselves like as such. Anyway, but it's also, there's a bit of memoir on there, right, about my father who struggled throughout really most of his adult life with alcohol addiction, and he largely at my behest tried different kinds of psychedelic therapy, ketamine and psilocybin mushrooms. So I write about that, and I try to sort of draw a connective line between Terence and his kind of milieu of the 1970s, the psychedelic 70s, and our, current quote unquote psychedelic renaissance. Anyway, yeah, in a nutshell, that's it.
Yeah. And, reading it struck me that it doesn't have as, I think the argument in your first book is a little clearer than the argument here. Mm. And that's not a dig. I think it's just a result, in my view anyway, of who you're dealing with here. Mm-hmm. Because Terence McKenna is kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
And in fact, you have incredible patience. I mean, I've had students ask me about McKenna before, et cetera. And every time I ever picked up anything that he wrote, it just it gets so wacky so fast that I just I start eye rolling, and then but you really go for it, trying to understand.
I mean, it's my kind of professional duty to do so. I mean, I think you can. I too have assigned chapters of True Hallucinations to largely to no avail in my classroom. My students tend to draw a blank, really. So there's a lot of hand holding by me through the kind of concepts and stuff, and there's a lot of eye rolling and kind of shoulder shrugging. And but yeah, he was a complicated guy with some complicated ideas. Some of them, potentially workable and interesting theories, others completely batshit and nonsensical. It's hard to know whether to say. Some of them he just made up out of whole cloth. But yeah, and I think you can kind of see me warm and then cool and then warm again to Terence throughout the book. I mean, I really began, as I say, as a kind of fanboy. Like I found True Hallucinations, stumbled across it totally randomly. Really, I was like, I think I thought I knew what it was, but it turns out I didn't, and I was totally kind of floored and flummoxed by it. But once I got into the book and started reading more of him and talking to people, like I spoke to several Colombian anthropologists, two in particular, Colombian anthropologists, and one Polish anthropologist who did her field work in a very remote part of the Amazon, the Colombian Amazon, actually, right on the sort of tail end of the Trocha, the trail connecting El Encanto to La Chorrera, which we'll probably get into later, and wrote this whole ethnography of the Munani tribe, this indigenous tribe there, and wrote a dictionary of Munani. I mean, but that's a whole another story. And I spoke to, several ethnobotanists like Wade Davis and Glenn Shepard and Terence's own brother, Dennis McKenna, who's also an important figure and instrumental in this book. And I just started to really cool on Terence and his ideas, especially when I went to this conference in Colorado and I started to see what I consider to be a kind of untoward influence on today's kind of psychonautism. I started to really wring my hands a little bit over him. But then again, towards the end of his life, at the end of the book, which which also coincides with the end of his life, narratively, I warmed again when I started to take a more charitable view of what Terence was up to, I think, and how, despite how dotty and kind of ridiculous some of his ideas were, he was really, what he was interested in, what he was really focused on was this idea of human flourishing and human well-being, and this,
human well-being though is like a species more than it's like a wellness thing, right? Like you really draw that distinction.
I mean, in terms of values, just as human values, and how some of those values just got totally washed out by the war on drugs and by the sort of irrationality and fear driven by that. And also just the desire to that Terence was really occupied with towards the end of his life of piercing the veil, the mystery of life and its inevitable tragedy, and how to deal with that grief.
Yeah.
And my pushback on Terence would be just to say that I think probably a better way to grapple with that, the grief, the inevitable loss of all our loved ones and everything we care about, would be compassion and love instead of, and not machine elves at the end of history or whatever, So,
right.
So I think while Terence was kind of onto something, very often he gets lost in his own kind of dotty mysticism.
Yeah. What did you like about? You said that you really liked it at first. What? Because when I've picked it up, I'm just like, ugh.
Yeah.
This sounds like utter bullshit. I'm out.
Yeah.
And but you liked it. What did you like about it?
Well, I'm a travel writer. I like travel and adventure. And it's really this plunge into the heart of the Amazon, a place that in a specific village that back then was very difficult to reach. Seaplane or a 4 or 5 day hike by extremely difficult trail. And that part I really liked. Terence is a good linear writer. I think that's one really charitable thing I could say about him. And he.
One terrible thing or charitable?
Charitable.
Oh,
sorry, charitable.
terrible.
Yeah. No. I generally take linear writing to be a good thing. Yeah. And he's not always that, but he is in that book, and that is, I think, far and away his best book. And
which his wife helped him edit.
Really helped him edit. It really took her hand, his kind of in narrative eye, to help bring that thing to fruition. He had written another version of it earlier that is almost unrecognizable. Some of the same concepts and locales feature in it, but it's altogether the opposite of linear.
Yeah.
But I think when I found out, partly what drew me to it also was when I found out where he was exactly, because I'd heard of La Chorrera, because I knew who Roger Casement was, who, for your listeners who might not know, was this great sort of famed Irish patriot and British consul who was famous in the early 20th century for investigating the rubber atrocities in the Belgian Congo, and then did the same in the Colombian Putumayo a half a dozen years later. And he's like in Ireland, he's all over the place. There's statues of him everywhere. In fact, there's a very, just as a indication of how much the Irish revere him, there's like a weird Irish guy in La Chorrera now trying to build a statue of Roger Casement in La Chorrera, which Chorrerans tend to be kind of, as you might imagine, like not at the top of the list of their priorities, you know, but they're not dismissive of it, I don't think. But anyway, Casement was also famously executed after or during the 1916 Easter Rebellion for funneling arms to Republican freedom fighters, I guess you could say. And so he was a complicated guy, but a very interesting historical figure who I knew about, and I knew about La Chorrera, and I thought, when I found out when it dawned on me that that's where they were, I was like, that's weird. That's interesting. I don't think anyone's ever written about that. Terence didn't totally realize it at the time.
Yeah.
He didn't even really know about the rubber atrocities that happened in the Putumayo and sort of headquartered in a way in La Chorrera. And all those kind of moving parts made me kind of curious and interested in the story.
And for the listeners, La Chorrera is like a little tiny town in the Putumayo of Colombia. It's super remote. There's only a flight every 2 weeks or something in and out. And why did just for the listeners, why did Terence want to go to La Chorrera?
Because he had heard, two reasons. Partly he was on the run from the law, or at least he imagined that he was. He had a bad habit of shipping hash and weed to the United States from Far Eastern destinations in the late 60s, early 70s, and got caught doing this.
The hippie trail.
Yeah, the hippie trail. He was all over the place, and I think shipping hash originally from India, and then I think from Nepal, and sort of financing his travels with that. And initially, it worked for a while. This is like the beginning of the drug war. I think not quite officially. Not till 1971 did Nixon inaugurate the drug war, but at the early days of, maybe a halcyon days when you could do this sort of thing and not have to worry too much about getting caught. But he did eventually, and was essentially on the lam for the better part of 2 years. And then, he and his brother went specifically to La Chorrera in search of an indigenous hallucinogenic plant that they had read about called ukuhe, that was in the Harvard Botanical Leaflets, an article by one of the great sort of founding fathers of ethnobotany named Richard Evans Schultes. Yeah. Who himself is an amazing figure and deserving of an epic biography. Wade Davis has a great book about him, but it's not just about Schultes. But he was a really phenomenal figure in this field, and so they went looking for this hallucinogen in La Chorrera.
And they didn't find it.
They were told kind of early on that it was taboo to even ask about it, but that that might have been true, but everything that I heard from people in La Chorrera that's not the case. We hung out with a couple of shamans there. They were like, no, it's like growing all over the place. Why would it be taboo? But Terence was led to believe that it wasn't. And anyway, they got sidetracked by the psilocybin mushrooms that were growing prolifically in the dung of white zebu cattle that was kept by the missionaries there. And it was just, they happened to arrive in a very, warm, rainy kind of spring day when it was just those kinds of things that were kind of in bloom and efflorescent everywhere, and they just got totally preoccupied with those. And they also had they were able to get some bark shavings from yahe, from ayahuasca. So they were like smoking that and also drinking it and taking mushrooms every day, putting mushrooms in their like omelets in the morning and stuff. And so they were just that was the carrot.
Yeah, it's an incredible story, and we won't get too much into. So you traveled a lot, Chorrera, and the last time we talked all about this because I was supposed to have gone on this trip with you, but I bailed at the last minute, and because there was going to be a long jungle hike and 3 nights in the jungle, which was totally insane, and I was like, nah, I'm out. And then you didn't have to do it, which is a drag. I would have gone had I known. But anyway, so we won't talk too much about that.
Sure.
But it is an incredible story. I do want to set the record straight about a couple things.
Here
Number one, you refer to me as a mediocre fisherman, which is just
I couldn't help it.
Such bullshit.
I couldn't help
It's unbelievable. I taught you like literally everything you know about fishing, and now I'm a mediocre fisherman, which is, that hurts. Yeah, it really hurts.
I couldn't help it.
Yeah.
I needed something in there.
Yeah. And do you want to clear the air about the Ohio River?
Sure.
Not running
yeah.
through
No.
it?
I hope maybe this will even air slightly before the book comes out, as so now I can make it a kind of apologia. It just that in the rush to write this book, just to come to my own defense a little bit. I had like a year. I'm like so envious of academic researchers who have like years and years, multiple sabbaticals to write. I had basically a year to write this book and another 4 months to kind of revise and just to put things in perspective. And then it turns out, irritatingly, I had to wait another 18 months for it to come out. But so there's a few errors, most of them just like kind of typos. There's some Spanish words in there that I didn't get 100% correct. But I do say at one point this is also in my own defense, that my copy editor, this book went through 2 phases of copy editing. That you might argue, but my copy editor or one of my readers, which I had a half dozen, should have caught this before it went to print. But no, I do say that the allude to the fact that the Ohio River runs through Columbus. What I mean, of course, is Cincinnati.
Yeah. And in your defense, you have people in both places. You got me in Cincinnati, and you got your in-laws in Columbus. And I presume that you just said Columbus when you meant Cincinnati. Yeah. But as I was reading it, I was like, ugh, this is definitely not correct.
Yeah.
So somebody's going to bust you on that for sure in some review. But
and also my people in Columbus are going to bust me on it. Yeah. Because I think I do. I think in every book I take a swing at Ohio State.
Yeah.
And so this isn't going to help my even in the book I'm currently working on. There's a little Ohio State dig in there. I just can't help it again. I can't help it sometimes.
Yeah.
Things just have to be said.
That's right. I agree. And we both went to Michigan, of course, and we're from Michigan. And actually, I wanted to ask you about. So you talk about some of our drug experiences, and specifically where we took when we were in high school, took LSD at the beach in on Lake Michigan, about 45 minutes from our where we grew up in Kalamazoo, Michigan. I want to ask you a little bit about that. I'm wondering if you remember that wasn't the first time you took LSD, right?
No.
It certainly wasn't the first time I took it. Do you remember the first time?
I think so, but my memory might be wrong here, but I think I do. What's your memory? Let me ask you first.
Well, mine, I don't think, I think I took it so I was with, I don't know if you were there, but certainly various members of our tight circle of friends were there. I don't want to out anybody on the podcast, but it was in South Haven too, which is where we were in the story you tell in the book. And I took it on my own, I think. And this guy that we knew, whose name I'll leave out, but he was really into the Grateful Dead. I mean, this is the moment. This is the late 80s. This is right as the Grateful Dead are becoming, reaching the peak of their power, becoming mainstream after, 2 decades of being underground. And I remember sitting around at his house and him playing us the Grateful Dead album, Dead Set, the live album from the early 80s. And then talking about LSD and this and that. And then he had given me some LSD. He might have been there. I don't remember. And I took like half a tab of LSD. And I don't remember much about it. It was, I think because it was a half a tab, it wasn't a super overwhelming experience or anything. I do remember some strange visual things. But that was it. It wasn't a particularly memorable experience, I have to say. I had other ones later that were super memorable, including mushroom ones. But But that's the first time I remember. Well, what do you remember?
Well, you said you were alone though, so I wasn't there.
I mean, I meant to say that I think I was alone in taking the LSD. That the others with us weren't. But maybe this guy who's I'm mentioning, maybe he was there, and we each took a half. I don't remember.
I don't have any memory of that at all. My memory of taking it is at my dad's house on Broadway.
Yeah.
One winter, might have been a New Year's Eve, I think. When for some reason my dad was out of town, and it was like us and the usual suspects. That's my memory of I could be wrong about that, but that's my first memory of it. Around or maybe either on or around New Year's Eve.
I'm wondering if it was Christmas.
It could have been.
Because there was a time we took it on Christmas, and then the next morning had to drive my sister-in-law, now ex-sister-in-law, this may have had something to do with it, to Chicago to drop her off.
Yeah, this rings a bell.
Do you remember?
Well, I said New Year's because I remember watching on the television, like I think the ESPN was playing, it's like, it might have been pre-New Year's, what it was playing, it's like year-end kind of clips, and so I think that was it. And listening to music really, really, really loud on my dad's stereo. Yeah. So I think that must have been, I think that was my first time.
Oh, really? Yeah. Interesting. Well, the next morning we had to drive them, and I think we took some more the next morning, and it may have been my actual sister too, but because she lived in Chicago at the time. But anyway, then we were almost assaulted. Do you remember that? We had to drive.
Was that the next morning?
Yeah,
the crazy White Sox fan, or
I don't know if he was a White Sox fan or not. But so we had to park.
Wasn't he wearing I thought he was wearing like a White Sox cap.
I don't remember. All I remember is the baseball bat.
Right.
Oh
my God!
We were trying to remember.
Yeah,
we were trying to get into this parking lot where they lived in this apartment complex, and when she got out of the car to ask the parking attendant guy what we should do because we didn't have a sticker or whatever.
Yeah.
And then this guy comes up behind us and just starts laying on the horn. It's like 7 in the morning, 7:30 the day after Christmas. And we're like, geez, what's the deal with this guy? And then he like wheels around and pulls up next to us and rolls down his window and starts screaming at us. And it's like, and we're just like, what the hell? And I think I was like, all right, man, all right, we'll move. Jesus, fuck you. Which was a big mistake.
Yep.
He says, fuck me. And he jumps out of his car, reaches into his backseat, and pulls out a baseball bat.
Yep.
And comes up and starts banging against the window.
Yep.
And we're like, what the fuck?
Yep.
And the parking attendant, so we're like, taken LSD the night before. I think maybe had taken it again on the drive.
Yeah.
And the guy opens the gate, and we just drive in and then jump out of the car and like run inside.
Yeah. And your sister-in-law called the police.
Yeah.
Right?
And she called the cops, and the cops came.
Yeah. A couple of these Chicago detectives come.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then remember, they had us, it turned out, we showed them the car that was parked, and turned out the guy was a member of the gym.
Mm-hmm.
And so they walked us inside, and we're walking through the gym with the cop looking for this guy.
Yeah.
And we're all basically still on LSD.
Yeah. Yeah, I do. God, it's funny. I had forgotten so many of those details, but yeah, it is kind of.
And and there's music. I remember there was like music playing. It was like, and it just was the most surreal thing in the world.
Yeah.
And we're trying to identify with these Chicago cops, identify some guy who's, I have no idea what the guy looked like, at that point. Like, all I remember is the baseball bat,
Yeah, we were unsuccessful.
And we were unsuccessful.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that may have been your first time. I certainly remember, I don't remember the night at all. I just remember the morning.
Oh, that's funny. I remember both of those, but I had not remembered that they were so close that they were essentially the same day. It's funny that, Terence always recommended, this is like the last thing in the world that I would ever want to do. But his whole thing was that you have to really be true blue psychonaut. You have to take psychedelics alone in the dark with, and if the dark wasn't enough with
blinders.
With blinders. And he and if you didn't do that, you weren't doing it the right way. And that, to me, the whole point of psychedelics, even back then, was to do it with your friends, both to have that, that kind of set and setting, as they say, kind of more reinforced, and just have some backup. But just for the fun of it, and there's nothing fun. I guess I don't measure up in Terence's eyes probably, but that just would seem totally just so unattractive an idea to me to do it alone and have that, not just have that experience on one's own, but just to wade those waters, those kind of potentially really treacherous waters by yourself.
Do you have any idea where? So that idea has endured. I know that they do that at like some of these psychedelic centers. I think the one at the University of Wisconsin where I visited last year, I think that's their standard operating procedure.
Yeah.
And
they usually have somebody in the room, though.
Well, yeah, somebody in the room, but I mean the blinders.
Yeah, the blinders. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
And in fact, when I talked to Ethan Nadelman last year, he mentioned doing a psychedelic session, and that was with the blinders on, and he said that he knows many people who think that that's the only way to do it. So I'm wondering if that's
that's how my
Terence's.
I don't know if he came up with that idea, but that's what he advocated for. Yeah.
Well, I know traditionally, the mushroom ceremony in Mexico, you do it at night.
Yeah.
I don't remember that it had to be in the dark necessarily, but it was at night.
Yeah.
And so that idea has been really influential. But we almost never did it that way. I mean, sometimes we did it at night, but never with the lights off.
Yeah.
And I remember doing LSD at your dad's house, like skipping school one day too.
Yep.
Like just in the middle of the, first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
Skipping class and going back there and taking LSD all day.
Yeah. The funnest thing to do was to go swimming. That's why we went out to the lake, I think, to be there. It was like a beautiful night, beautiful day, beautiful evening to watch the sunset and be in the lake while the sun went down. And
oh my God. Yeah.
What an experience. And I don't know. It just seems like that we're potentially missing out on something, but maybe that's the difference just between the sort of therapeutic approach and just doing it for kicks.
I remember that day we did it at your dad's during the day. Two things about it. One was I remember sitting there with a piece of bread, like a piece of white bread, slice of white bread you get from, sandwich bread, and just sitting there and pressing on it and watching the bread kind of, squish and then kind of reform, and that just being mesmerized by this for I don't know how long. And then the other thing, I don't know if you remember this part, is a dog came to the door. Like
I don't remember that.
And the dog had one of those cones on its head.
Oh, I do remember.
And
this.
I
remember the dog.
I had never seen a dog with a cone on its head. And so I'm on LSD and look out the door, and there's a fucking dog with this thing on its head. And I just started laughing hilarious. I was like, what the fuck is the deal with that dog? I had no idea. Yeah.
You have several dogs in your psychedelic
experiences.
Past. Yeah, it's like a meme.
It is. I'm always terrified or driven to laughter by dogs in some way. Yeah.
That's fun.
All right. So this is what I want to ask you about it, though. Do you have any memory of what you thought about LSD before you took it? Like what it meant to you? Like I'm really interested in this. I do all these oral histories with people about drugs, and I'm always asking them these kind of questions. And given that you've written a book about this, I'm wondering if you have any memory of that. What LSD meant in the late '80s before we took it? Yeah, or other psychedelics.
I don't think so. It's funny. I think I'm going to have a question for you along these lines later this evening when you come and guest lecture in my drug journalism class, just about how we intuited this kind of discord between the sort of official, sort of reefer madness take on drugs and alcohol back then, and our, I think, innate understanding that was somehow the inconsistency between that view and like the kinds of stuff our parents were up to. Like my dad was, when we were taking LSD, my dad was probably drinking a fifth of scotch a day and probably smoking several packs of Marlboro Lights or whatever, And I remember right around that time, I think I was 15 or 16, my dad finding a roach in my corduroys. I think I write about this in the book, and it grounding me for a month. And so the obvious discord between that and my dad's behavior was that was clear to me and apparent. But I don't think I had any, I didn't think it was dangerous. I don't think I had any expectations. I just thought it would be kind of mind blowing.
Yeah,
and fun. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I'll one step further. And I've actually write about this in the manuscript I'm working on. We somehow knew, even though what we knew was wrong, which is I find very interesting, and I'll be talking about that today in your class. We somehow knew that weed was harmless. That was just in the cultural air. Yep. I think it actually has something very specific to do with the film Reefer Madness and the way that phrase has taken on a life of its own, had taken on a life of its own by that time. But we just knew that it's harmless somehow. It was just in the cultural era. I mean, this is obviously prior to the internet, and we weren't like reading High Times ever, I don't think, or so you just heard this stuff and you just had this sense, and we had this, at least I had this sense that people who believed that marijuana was harmful were suckers. They had, they believed the hype, and that was obviously bullshit. And I actually think that's what made marijuana enticing in many ways. Is like it was a way to show that you weren't one of the dum-dums,
right?
Like, you weren't part of the Just Say No crowd, which was at its peak, of course, at that time. It was also a way to symbolize your, solidarity, I guess, or identification with the 60s, the
rebellion,
counterculture, and all that stuff. So that was certainly, and I think actually, and I write about this, I think actually that belief, even though it was misguided, because cannabis isn't totally harmless and it can have some, significant psychiatric consequences for some users, because we so strongly believed that it was totally harmless, when we like overdid it and had bad experiences because of setting, we were able to ride out those experiences without too much trouble, because we were so, we believed it so strongly.
Yeah,
right.
Sure.
And I think that in your book, you mention that Terence finally has a bad trip in like 1989 or something, like right around the same time, after, 2 decades of advocating for people taking these heroic doses, which is an idea, that's a term he coined, I think, right?
Yep.
Heroic doses of psilocybin, so 5 grams, which is a pretty heavy dose, right? The typical therapy nowadays, like a 3.5 gram, eighth of an ounce dose. But then he doesn't say anything about it, and it's only his now ex-wife, right, who told you about this? Yeah. And she thought it was ethically problematic that he's telling people to take 5 grams by yourself in the dark when he's had a horrible experience, which apparently he didn't then take mushrooms again for a decade or something.
Yeah, like 10 years. Yeah. Until the very end of his life.
Yeah, and she thought... Now, on the one hand, I totally agree with her that that is unethical. Like, you should be saying something. It's another one of the things that makes him, kind of an unsympathetic character to me. It's just like, there's a lot of bullshit. And his commitment to the truth, whatever that might be, was like, he wasn't that into science, even though originally he had a very scientific mind. He didn't really believe in science, and he was willing to just make shit up, and et cetera, et cetera. However, on the other hand, if Terence McKenna came out and made a big deal about how he had had a terrible trip, you could argue that made it more likely that all the people who listened to him were going to have bad trips too.
Right? Yeah. Sure.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
And that, I've always found this part of drugs like really, really fascinating, especially when it comes to psychedelics, or cannabis too, which is not technically a psychedelic, but it's kind of certainly psychedelic adjacent, shades in. Anyway, so I think that's really fascinating. And as far as the original question, like, what did we think about it? I can't remember exactly, but I remember identifying it with the 60s and us, at least me, I'll speak for myself, identifying with the 60s, hating the 80s, hating the politics of the 80s, the music of the 80s. And these drugs were just, the ultimate symbols of the counterculture, really. I mean, especially marijuana. It's like, and obviously when you learn a little more about it, you realize, well, LSD was, the centerpiece of the whole drug experimentation thing.
And it was all the music we listened to, all the people we kind of idolized. Like, I mean, until at least the late 80s, early 90s, when hip hop came along, it was like, that was our main sort of cultural touchstone, was like the Woodstock generation, basically, Yeah, I also wonder if Terence had been more upfront about that, whether or not it would have had like a kind of negative downstream effect on the psychedelic kind of renaissance in general. It would have maybe not only resulted in myriad bad trips, but just put people off psychedelics more generally.
Right. Well, and that's an interesting question. This is what I'll be talking about with your students later, that I think that a key factor in the legalization of marijuana has been a lot of misinformation
Yep.
about the history of marijuana. This kind of mythology that it's a totally harmless drug, that it was only prohibited because of conspiracies or racism or that. All that stuff is bullshit, but it actually had what I think is actually a happy result, which is the end, the ongoing end of the war on marijuana, which I think almost everyone would agree was a bad thing. That is the war on marijuana, and ending that is good. Now, whether the way it's being legalized and so forth is a good thing, that's more up for debate.
Yeah.
With the corporatization of cannabis and all that stuff,
Yeah.
and we could debate that.
I also asked my students, I talk about this, of whether or not, when we were kids, that you just got through, really finished saying, is that weed had this kind of illicit, rebellious kind of connotation, and, not so much. It was transgressive and, potentially seen as dangerous anyway, and you could go to jail, and now it's like how mom and dad unwind on the weekends,
right?
It's, or even grandma and grandpa. It's how like you got parents kind of hotboxing in their cars, picking their kids up from school. And anyway, I don't have a point to that so much, but I wonder if, having lost some of its illicit kind of connotations, if it has become and attained simultaneously an almost kind of medical connotation, like a wellness sort of, I hate that word, but a wellness kind of connotation, that it has had a negative impact in a way that people didn't quite foresee.
What do you mean by negative?
Well, just the fact that people think it's, I call this, I have this pet theory. It's called like the Snoop Dogg Willie Nelson paradox, like that, and this association with kind of, cool and transgressive and underground, but has now become mainstream and is now, helps explain why people feel like they want to take edibles every single day of their lives. But not everybody is a fucking rap star or a country music star.
Right.
And like not everybody has, some people are just impermeable to these drugs and also alcohol in ways that other people aren't, you know? And so not everybody's fucking Snoop Dogg, so,
for sure.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So
and most of us, like, as we get older, I mean, when we were in high school, like if you had told us that in 25, 30 years, weed was going to be legal all over the place in the country and you could just go down to the store and buy, I mean, we would have been rejoicing, like trying to find a time machine to get up to this period, right? And it would have been amazing. But now that we're in our 50s and like I can barely smoke weed ever anymore because I get so hungover, right? Yeah. But if I was like wedded to this notion that it's totally harmless and it doesn't lead to the old stories, there's no hangover, it's not addictive. All this stuff is total bullshit. For some people, different people have wildly different levels of tolerance to cannabis and can, some people can smoke weed all day and actually get a lot of stuff done. I could never do that ever in 1,000 years, right? Yeah. Even smoking weed the night before, I can just feel my performance the next day dip. Yeah. Right?
Yeah. The Seth Rogans of the world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Right. Somebody like Seth Rogen, who probably can't, conceive of somebody not being able to handle it the way he does, right? I have no idea. But you get the idea. Yeah. So anyway, I did want to mention one more story about because you mentioned taking psychedelics was like something you did with your friends. It was like, and totally. And in fact, I think maybe the best psychedelic experience I ever had was at school, strangely, but not during school. It was during, I was in the choir, so we were all required to be in the school musical. And we were doing South Pacific. And I was, one of the scrubs in the background, just one of the sailors. The chorus, they called us, right? And anyway, me and two friends, two guys but I won't mention them on here. We drove down the street. They gave us a break for lunch or whatever, and then we drove down the street. This was on what they called Tech Sunday, so it was on the Sunday where they do all the technical stuff for the show. You had to be there like 10 hours straight and get everything together for the live performance and all the lights and all the music, And we weren't really into it. It was kind of a major drag to have to be up at school on a Sunday. Even today, that would be a major drag to me to have to spend all day at school on a Sunday. So we went down the street behind the Big Lots in Kalamazoo and took a bunch of mushrooms. And then we smoked a little bit of weed. And quite powerful weed. And we got back to school just as the mushrooms were coming on, and we were quite stoned. And I remember walking into the building where all the other students were, and it being way too much. Like we were like, oh my God, what have we done? And then sitting in the auditorium right afterward, we had to sit in the auditorium while the teacher, Ms. Kerstetter, had to or was telling us about what we were going to do in the afternoon. And I think the three of us were all feeling the same, like, oh my God, we overdid it. What were we thinking? This is going to be a nightmare. Oh my God, oh my God. And then she did some weird thing where she gesticulated wildly and made some crazy noises, illustrating some point. I have no idea what it was. But it was so bizarre and strange that it made us all start cracking up laughing, like uncontrollably. It was just hilarious. And that like pushed us through.
Sure.
Just the hilarity of the whole thing, and we're just laughing and can't stop. It's like being in church when you can't stop laughing, and it's just even funnier because you can't stop laughing. And once we did that, it was like the rest of the day was magic, magic, because we could hang out up in the rafters, and with the stage lighting on, and all these people are in costume. And you're on this set, and it was people singing and all this shit, and it was incredible. It was so fun. That's fun. But that was it wasn't blindfolded, and there wasn't any sort of psychological breakthroughs for us. It was just fun. The Jerry Garcia, just have fun and not worry about it sort of thing. So I agree that.
Yeah, and that's kind of a place where I part ways with the whole psychedelic renaissance, is the idea that not that it doesn't have therapeutic uses, and it hasn't proved to be helpful to people who really have a hard time finding help anywhere else, but but the connotation that it is inherently therapeutic in some way. I mean, it certainly can be, again, but I don't know. I've just never had that experience. I've only ever had the other experience, this kind of explosion of consciousness and kind of transcendental fun, like that. And in fact, my favorite and most memorable psychedelic experience would have been that evening in South Haven, right up to the point that we decided to go downtown, which was a huge mistake.
Dumbest decision ever.
And met a roiling crowd of lunatics and drunks. But up until then, the first half of that was probably one of the most memorable evenings of my entire life. And I guess my only point is that sometimes I cringe a little bit, to use a word that my daughter is very fond of, but I cringe a little bit at the implication that it has to be any more than that. Which I feel like I hear all the time. My students have imbibed that idea that there's their psychedelics, all sort of kinds of psychedelics are inherently therapeutic and necessarily like directly about this idea of human flourishing, and I just sort of feel like shrugging and saying like, well, they don't need to be, I mean, they certainly can be, but I don't know. That's where Terence, in my book, I go back and forth with Terence, and figuratively speaking, about this quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, at the same time, on the one hand, I think it's a good thing that people take them seriously, right? So if they're thinking about them in terms of therapy, and then hopefully they're taking them seriously, because it is important. And they are really powerful drugs. Yeah. LSD is the most powerful psychoactive drug we know of, and you do have to be careful.
Yeah.
And so it's good to take them seriously. On the other hand, even those fun moments, not this one that I just described because it was at school, and I always hated being at school, and I'll never like having been in high school. Just like my son today, who doesn't like high school. A real chip off the old block. But there were other times where it was mainly fun. It wasn't like a religious experience but that I think. So, for example, taking LSD and sitting on the side of a dune in the Upper Peninsula, looking at the sunset over Lake Superior was amazing. And while I didn't have any deep thoughts about that, I still, to this day, the memory of that just is in my marrow. And when I just think about it, I get warm feelings. And when I go up to northern Michigan, I still have those warm feelings. And I feel like those experiences also help me recapture a love of nature which I always loved as a kid, but there was something about the psychedelic experience, and with weed too. And I really would consider weed a psychedelic. Whoa! What happened? What happened?
Cramp in my. I gotta.
This is great. This is great content, as they say.
Sorry,
John's got a cramp in his ass. Apparently.
No. My it happens when I sit in these chairs for too long. I can feel it coming on. Sorry. You know what's funny is that has happened. That tends to happen whenever I have like a meeting with like an editor or something on Zoom, and I got to sit at a table like this. And
you almost said this.
Anyway, it's hard to explain. It's very awkward when it happens. Yeah, it's hard to explain to like a editor in New York what just happened when you leap up from the table screaming in agony.
Probably cost you a few gigs.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's great. I'm so glad we have that on tape. Yeah. That's great.
I hear what you're saying. I guess the only, just going back to Terence, my problem with him is this whole desire to kind of import more meaning and significance when maybe they're, the whole machine elves at the end of history stuff that was Terence's. Yeah. When really we should just be about, I think so often it is exactly that sense of connectivity to others, to nature, this transcendent sense of there being multiple the self behind the mask, and it's just that I think can be incredibly moving and powerful without it necessarily being a mystical or spiritual or religious experience that I have.
Yeah.
That's what I claim in my book, that Terence kind of imported to the whole psychedelic narrative, not only, but not by himself, but and it's not as though some of those feelings aren't intrinsic to the psychedelic experience, but Terence really evangelized and proselytized on behalf of that very idea over and over and over and over again. Made its living at it, drumming that point home over, and I guess that's the sort of little bone I have to pick with him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, another major theme here is the problem of. So you talk about Roland Griffiths and the longtime researcher at Johns Hopkins who did all this research. I mean, talk about people who helped bring psychedelics into the mainstream. He does all this laboratory-controlled research on psychedelics in the early 2000s, gets a ton of press, and that really helps this stuff become more mainstream. He died a couple of years ago, and then I don't know if it was after his death or before, probably before, some complaints came out from people in his lab about what they considered unethical practices, among them sort of leading people down certain roads to lead to certain happy outcomes when they took psychedelics.
Yeah, the mystical experience questionnaire, which probably anyone who's read Michael Pollan probably knows about that. But yeah. He could the implication was that Griffiths, who was by all accounts a lovely guy and a very, I think the sort of end game for him was to help people, you know, and he did, I think, by virtue of his research at Hopkins. He was like the real foundational figure in this stuff, and so I don't mean to like try to tear him down or anything, but yeah, he certainly was hand-holding people through the experience and leading them towards, articulating a certain kind of outcome laden with spirituality and mysticism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My thing, though, is I don't think psychedelics are going to be therapeutic unless you do that. Like, they require a guide, Yeah. I mean, you can... I guess Terence advocated being by yourself, and but even then, you have some idea of what you're going for. And this is the same critiques, and I've talked about this on the podcast before with Eric and Dick, and maybe with you too when on your other episode. The critiques of psychedelic therapies in the 1950s when they were first happening in Saskatchewan and for treatment of alcoholism, among other things, was that they were basically loading the deck for happy outcomes. So they were creating a set and setting, a atmosphere in which the patients were likely to succeed in their desire to quit drinking or whatever, get over whatever psychological problem they were having. And I think this is where fundamental. I mean, you write a little bit about this, that psychotherapy, which was the thing to do in the middle of the 20th century, psychoanalysis, psychoanalysis in the middle of the 20th century was all about getting people changing the narrative in their head about what was going on. Mm-hmm. And the whole idea of psychedelics is really to do more like what Buddhists are after, which is to shut down the narratives,
Yep.
get the narratives to quiet, and then you can actually see the world as it is.
Yeah.
And so you say there's a fundamental clash between the desire for therapy and what psychedelics actually do.
Yeah.
And I think that's really true if we stick to this scientific method of how we're supposed to prove the efficacy of drugs.
Sure.
But actually, if you just buy into that and allow these substances to as a tool for whether it's psychoanalysis or any other kind of psychotherapy, then they can be incredibly effective, right? And I don't see what the problem is with that.
No, I don't have a problem with that.
I'm not saying that you have a problem.
No, that's why I talk about William James, the great father of, philosopher and sort of father of American psychology. Is he would have said, as long as they're effective, as long as people are finding salutary uses, then the science, the quote unquote truth behind it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Right? So, and I totally agree with that, and that's part of the point of me, mentioning my son and this kind of sad, troubling story about my son fell ill when I was writing this book. And that was really our first encounter as parents, certainly. And really maybe for me ever in my life with like that real sort of suffering that was like nobody could help with, and the point is not there. I think my wife is worried that people we're going to have offend people or something in our family or friends or whatever, but that's not the point. The point is just how many people, when I realized we brought our son to the Boston Children's Hospital, which is this famous hospital for obviously, as the name implies, for children.
Yeah.
People come from
the best in the world.
People come from all over the world, and taking him there to see a pediatric neurologist to try to figure out what's going on with him, and seeing. I mean, it's this huge building, huge atrium, like floor after floor after floor. The elevator doors opening while we're headed up to we were third or fourth floor. It wasn't that high, but. And just seeing all these kids with skull caps and in wheelchairs and on crutches, and just realizing how desperate people are how desperate people are to relieve their suffering, how little help that they are finding, either in the sort of traditional medical establishment or from friends and family. A lot of people out there are just completely at a loss, at loose ends in terms of finding any help at all. And in that case, to deny people access to drugs that may help them seems completely sadistic, and that's the point of that. And I don't care at that point. I don't really care about the science, I mean, at a fundamental level, that's kind of irrelevant to me. And I mean, and to be clear, I'm not advocating psychedelics for children and everything, although there is a wing of the psychedelic movement that does do that. But that's not my point. It's not necessarily that we should have given Ignatz magic mushrooms or something to help, but just that the suffering among us should arguably have access to help when no other help is forthcoming. And how we're all sort of just connecting back to the psychedelic experience, this sort of feeling that we all have innately, I think, of being alone, and just ultimately kind of alienated from our friends and family to some degree, this sense of interiority that is hard to break free of sometimes. Mm-hmm. This is a line of sentiment that you could trace back to all the way from Rilke to David Foster Wallace said that, we just have this very finite ability to help one another. We just can't, and we want to, but we just can't do it. We can a little bit, we can. Yeah. But at the end of the day, how much help can you really give? Maybe the one exception there is our spouse or partners who share a bed with us, but otherwise, even then, it's they're not gonna. They can only give so much of themselves, and that we there's just a limited amount of help to be gotten and to be given, and that psychedelics kind of bridge this gap between our kind of helplessness and doing something about it.
Yeah. That again brings me back to, one of the problems that I have with somebody like Terence, and there are lots of people like this in the history of marijuana, is this just tenuous connection to the truth, to its willingness to just make stuff up or whatever.
Yep.
The idea being, the ends justifying the means. Certainly in the cannabis movement, this was the case, as I was mentioning earlier. And in what you're describing, I think if people are if people have some idea about psychedelics that maybe isn't necessarily scientifically provable, but it's helping, then who cares? Totally agree. The problem, of course, is what you deal with in your chapter where you get into the marketing of this stuff and the whole business, is that all of a sudden people also have a strong interest in saying whatever just to make money, which is a whole other problem.
Yeah. And that's pretty endemic to the medical establishment in general, as I understand. According to my wife, who is a doctor, is like if you go to a typical medical conference, it's just full of like snake oil salesmen and hustlers and quacks. And so that's kind of to be expected. And there's a good amount of hand-wringing in the psychedelic underground about this commodification. And it's, you know, like understandably, like, and I don't know how much they're going to be. I mean, people are trying, but like, I don't know how you're good. You know, we don't have to necessarily have this conversation because I think we might have had it in an earlier podcast, but like how they're going to scale up. Like, how do you commodify something like psilocybin?
I don't understand
that you can grow enough magic mushrooms in your closet for you and your friends and everybody they know for like a year, you know, like really, you know, like, and for $50, you know? So.
Well, you know, another is an interesting twist on this though, since the last time we talked. I went to this conference in the Netherlands in March, and we were talking about, it was mainly about indigenous psychedelics in Latin America. And one of the concerns of people there was that all these indigenous psychedelics are being co-opted by, you know, I mean, people in Latin America are Westerners too, but by, you know, people from the global North, we could put it, and to make money, to make a profit, and that the people in the and one of the points of view was that, you know, the traditions, the history of this stuff in the Americas, the people who developed a lot of these methods, you know, again, we were talking about blindfolding, you know, I presume this comes from the practice in Mexico of always doing this at night and so forth. You know, those people aren't getting any credit, et cetera, which I get. On the other hand, one of the points I made in this discussion was, well, geez, maybe the best thing that could happen for these people in the Americas is for this stuff to be commodified so that nobody has to fucking go there and fuck up their habitats and go to, you know, northern Mexico to find peyote and go to La Chorrera to find the real stuff, or go to, you know, which, as you mentioned in your book, these people who want to go and have the real ayahuasca experience. You know, Terence suggested that ayahuasca had been used by indigenous people in the Americas for millennia, and there's just like no evidence that this is actually the case. And in fact, the practices of these shamans in Brazil and other places has actually evolved with the desires of these tourists who come to use it. Wouldn't it maybe be better if all this shit were available down the street in New York City or wherever, and those people don't have to go and fuck up all these environments, you know?
Totally. Yeah, no, I see the appeal. It's funny because we like one of the first nights I was in La Chorrera, they sat us down. We were like in the Moloko, which is like the kind of traditional longhouse, and they made a big point of sitting us down and like asking for help and asking our advice on like how could, basically in a few words, like how could they not be so poor, you know, and which they are, you know. I mean, it's the middle of the Amazon, and they get some stipend from the government, but they're not, that maybe goes without saying, but at least materially, they're not, you know, comparable to what we would consider to be, you know, materially well off. But they, and there was some talk of like doing like drug tourism there. And I was like, you know, I guess you guys could do like you'd have a website and you could fly people in. It's a 2-hour flight from Leticia, which is a pretty big exchange, you know, like major airports serve it. You could like figure out a way to fly people in, and you'd have to have a lodge. You'd have to have electricity. Like they do have electricity, but it's for a couple hours a day. If it got like an oil burning station. But I kind of was like, do you really want to do that? Like, I mean, maybe they do. I don't know. It's not for me to say, but that's also one of the reasons I'm kind of elliptical in the book about our experience, our drug experience there, both with hallucinogens and with coca and tobacco, which are, just to point out, are the two main religious sacraments among the people we hung out with. Coca is central to the whole indigenous cosmology. Same with tobacco, and they're always taken together. Ayahuasca is considerably downstream from that. I mean, it's not even close. You know, it's in the sort of medicine cabinet, but not quite as obviously as people seem to think. They don't use it, and they certainly don't use it for the same reasons that people like tech bros from Silicon Valley are using it. It's not about I was going to say it's not about healing. It's not only about healing. Traditionally, most, ayahuasca seems to have been mostly about having luck in the hunt.
Yeah.
Finding lost objects and stuff like that. And that's not revelatory. People know that. But
well, this is another mythology that you write about really eloquently in the book, which is this mythology that Terence pushed and all sorts of people push all the time. This notion that all these indigenous groups in the Amazon were always peaceful, and it's only the imperialists who came in, and it's just fucking nonsense.
It's bullshit.
And these drugs were often connected to violence.
In fact, the emergence of ayahuasca, there's a really brilliant anthropologist at UC Santa Cruz, I think, Amanda Smith, who makes a strong case for ayahuasca, the emergence of ayahuasca being tied to white contact with indigenous tribes. I don't think there's a smoking gun there, but it's it's interesting that and it's certainly true. I think you could claim that the Western conception of ayahuasca and how ayahuasca is used in the indigenous context, at least in the Amazon basin, is considerably at odds with reality.
Yeah.
They just it's not and it has been changed by shamans to accommodate Western tourists, as you said.
Yeah. All right, so a little bit off topic, but not really. So one of the things, as I was reading the book, that struck me is just what a great writer you've become.
Well, thank you.
And well, I mean, so we've known each other forever, and in high school we were both academic disasters.
I'm tearing up a little bit.
Yeah, I'll stop. We were academic disasters.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, we were just talking about this morning. I was talking to my wife on the phone, and she was upset at our son for his 26 tardies this term.
Carlos.
Junior in high school, and not academically inclined.
That's funny.
I mean, really smart, but just doesn't give a shit and hates high school and real chip off the old block.
Yeah,
I was
totally.
exactly the same way.
Yeah,
And I was telling Patricia this morning, I was like, look, he's got 26 tardies. At least they're just tardies. Mine were 26 absences. And we would leave school and we'd go smoke weed. And he's not doing any of that stuff as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
And then I was like, I'm about to interview John. And John, he was even more of a disaster than me in high school, as I remember. And
barely graduated. Right?
And now he's become this incredibly well-read, terrific writer that I don't know if anybody would have predicted that back in the day.
Maybe Jim Kaler, my former high school guidance counselor. He was always in my corner.
Oh, really?
Only in part because he married my mother.
Yeah, but he was in your corner. A famously nice guy. So anyway, I wanted to ask you, because we've never talked about this. When did the light go on for you, academically? I mean, you started out at Eastern Michigan. I started out at Michigan. Somehow I got into Michigan. I still don't know really how. Well, I think we were a little different in high school. In high school, I think you fucked around all the time, and I would go quarter by quarter. I liked to prove that I could do it.
Yeah.
And so at one quarter I'd get 4.0, and then the next quarter I'd get all D's.
Yep.
So one quarter to prove it, the other to prove that I didn't give a fuck. That was sort of my mentality.
Just to make a point.
Yeah, just to make a point that I don't give a shit about that. And so my grade, I was had middling grade point average by the time I finished. And I go to Michigan. You go to Eastern Michigan, was right down the road in Ypsilanti. Yeah. And so on Friday nights in college, I would ride the bus down to Eastern, and we'd hang out and party and anyway, then you eventually came over to Michigan and so forth. But I've never asked you, when did the light start going on academic? And then when did you realize you wanted to be a writer? Because that also was sort of out of left field. I don't know. I don't remember reading a book in high school.
Yeah, no, I think the light went on when I got to Eastern, actually. And I was I remember one of the first classes, because I think I got in on academic probation. I mean, that's how bad my grades were. And I think I was forced to take a class that was essentially I can't remember what it was called, but it was full of people like me who really arguably had no business being in college. I should have been pumping gas, basically. It was only because my parents...
No offense to people pumping gas.
Yeah, no offense. Yeah. In many ways, it's preferable to being a writer. But it's only because I had the parents I did. They insisted I apply to college, and I did, and I got into one Eastern. And I went, and that very first semester, they put all of us kind of remedial types in a class that was essentially here's how you read a book. Literally, you read the flap, you read the back flap, you open it, you read. Maybe you're taking notes and you're underlining, and then that sort of thing. Basically, this is how you are a student, a competent student. And I was smart enough to know that I should not have wound up here, and I was like, oh, okay. this is fucked up. Like, and I got to get my shit together. So I did. And then I eventually transferred to Michigan, and I was pretty serious about school then, way more than ever before. I think just partly because of almost like a mirror of what you're describing, just to the novelty of finally being a good student, you know, like it always been a disappointment. But then the writing thing happened. I always loved to read, and, even if what I was reading was kind of strange, it's like not what I would want to read today. But I think, after college, I took a few years off, and then I decided to apply to grad school. And I wanted to either be a journalist or a kind of like an essayist, like a writer, like for a newsstand magazine or something like that. And do
you remember when that idea occurred to you?
It was like in that sort of, my kind of gap year, except my gap year was 5 years, I think. And I don't know exactly what was how it gestated, but I decided that I wanted to go to school for writing, that I didn't want to do anything else. I knew I didn't want to have a desk job, or at least not an office job. I do have a desk job, but it just is at home. Right. I didn't want to have an office job. And ironically, I did have an office job for most of my adult life, as working for magazines and newspapers and like copy edit departments and
fact checking.
And the whole time, for most of that time I was writing and trying to, pitching and trying to publish. But, I was 50 by the time my first book came out. So it was a long, I went to grad school in 2023. I graduated in 2003 and my first book came out in 2024. So it took 21 years for me to kind of close the circle on that, so anyway, I don't know if that answered your question, but I guess I liked reading and I liked writing, and I certainly liked the idea of reading and writing as an occupation. I imagine when I went to grad school, I went to grad school at Colombia with many people whose names you would recognize, listeners might recognize, and I was like, oh, I'm just going to be like one of these guys and like sitting at home writing essays that are going to be bought by the Atlantic or the New Yorker or whatever. Instead, I was writing for like online, writing for free for like, long defunct news sites at the time, anyway, so yeah, it took me a long time to figure out what it was I was good at doing, what my skill set was, and what I liked writing about. And I think once I figured that out, once I was good at travel writing, I was happy working in that idiom, comfortable working with this sort of built-in sense of forward momentum that made things a lot easier for me. And I started writing a lot for travel pages for newspapers and magazines. I wrote a lot for the New York Times travel section. That was really formative for me. And I had a really good editor early on who kind of helped me think a lot about what a good travel story was. And then then the pandemic happened. This is more of an answer than you wanted, but I think not by accident, the pandemic happened is right when the whole book thing kind of gestated for me also.
Why? Because there's nowhere to go?
Yeah. And just, I think it was starting to happen, but something about having children and just like needing to figure it out and how I was going to make more money and justify my life at home. Yeah. Besides taking care of my kids is like, but I had this editor at the New York Times travel section for a long time, and I remember him telling me like, if you want to write a travel story that's going to be like front page travel story in the travel section, like above the fold, you need 3 elements, kind of overlapping things. If you want to write something, besides like the 36 hours in Cape Cod or whatever, right. You want to write like a really substantive story that people are going to remember. Is that you need a place, but the second thing is you need either a person or like an animating idea connected to that place. And then the third thing, you need some sort of sense of topicality or relevancy now. And so I stumbled on that Bigfoot book, and that seemed to have all 3 of those for me. And certainly Terence and La Chorrera, and then the psychedelic renaissance, all kind of. So I started. It almost has become easier, and the freelance publishing world is so fraught and just unsatisfying and unrewarding that it's almost easier to write books. It's even though it takes longer, it's almost more rewarding and certainly more lucrative to write books than it is to try to make a living as a freelance writer, which I did for 15 years.
Yeah, sure. Well, and you get the product. I mean, I remember when I finished the Bigfoot book, I
Yeah.
just said to you, congratulations, man, you wrote a great book.
Yeah.
And like when you write a great book, you just, I mean, it's an achievement and it just sticks with you forever. I mean, I was just talking to my former advisor, John Womack Jr., the day before yesterday, and he wrote a great book in 1969, and it's still on the fucking shelf at the Harvard bookstore. Like it's still in print. It's like unbelievable.
Yeah,
His whole that's been like both I think a gift and a curse for him in some ways, that for that first book to have been such a massive success. But I mean, it really is like, and I know I feel that way about my book. I was really happy with my book, and I'm still, that's probably again been a kind of a gift and a curse. Like I haven't written another book. But anyway, so I do think there is a big reward if you write the book you wanted to write. Yeah. You know what I mean?
For sure. Yeah. Till the reviewers are done with it.
And sure, yeah.
And they see that you said the Ohio River goes through Columbus.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I can't wait to see who the first one.
Somebody's gonna just eat that up. Yeah,
we should do a bet on the over under of how many reviews are out before somebody mentions.
Fortunately, so many of those reviewers live in New York City. They have no fucking idea where the Ohio River, if it's even in the state of Ohio. So,
well, I think that's probably why nobody noticed, because most of the people who were reading your book, and I didn't read that chapter. I read a couple of the chapters, but I hadn't read that one, so I would have busted you.
Yeah.
All right, so last question about this. Do you ever wonder, it said you were 50 before your first book, your major book comes out. Do you ever wonder if you could go back, would you do it differently in high school than what we did? Do you ever wonder about that? Because I think about that sometimes. I mean, I've had a very successful career. I'm super happy with where I'm at and everything else. But I sometimes wonder, geez, how would things have been different if, like, beginning in 9th grade, I started reading all the time and studying and actually paying attention, like trying, rather than it taking me like another 7 years before I actually got like really serious about academics.
Yeah. Oh yeah, for sure. Like these people who say they don't have any regrets, it's like, are you kidding me? I regret everything.
Really?
Everything. Yeah.
See, I don't have any
everything. Yeah. No, but I mean, in all seriousness, at high school, it was like, I was not high school material. Like, I don't know. I was also, full disclosure, I was having kind of mental health issues through some of those years, and that didn't help. And I was, so it would have been, looking back, even if I wanted to do very well in high school, I think I kind of squeaked through for a reason. But yeah, of course, like I would have loved to have skipped, my first couple of years at Eastern and just gone to Michigan, where like my sister was going, all my friends were going, with a couple of exceptions. And so yeah, that part I regret. I think I would have loved to have, incoming freshmen at Michigan. I think that I would have liked that. Yeah. So yeah, there are certain things that I would have changed, but knowing myself, I don't think that it was possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what I think about, like, as we were talking about before, I think part of the reason we were interested in drugs and skipping school and all that stuff was that we were willing to think about, think outside of the box and actually had a proclivity to criticize things. Mm-hmm. And to, think kind of hard. You took some pride in like being willing to think about things differently. Yeah. And so I think that ultimately that led us to taking drugs. It led us to skipping school, being shitty students, but it also eventually led us to be really curious about, these kinds of matters and able to write about them in some, useful way, probably.
I mean, it's interesting that I don't know if I was going to raise this later tonight too, but just the fact that we both, I mean, I'm sort of transient in this field, I think, because of the Terence McKenna stuff. I don't think I'll dwell that long on this, but we both ended up writing these books about drugs and major movements in drug history and stuff. And I think that's not a coincidence, probably.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, you're right. You're right. What you know, I suppose.
Yeah.
Cool, man. This is awesome. Anything else you want to cover?
No, I don't think so. I just, I'm kind of curious. Actually, I wanted to ask you about something because and you feel free to take this out if you want, but I make sort of some big claims about Terence in the book, and the one thing the main one is that that he claims in terms of what he kind of bestowed upon this sort of psychedelic underground. And the main thing is I say that he kind of gave us, he was really the one, and there's a big caveat here because it was Dennis, but it was Terence who claimed to have figured out how to cultivate magic mushrooms at home. Yeah. And this is hard to establish with any certainty because we're talking about a Schedule 1 controlled substance that back then could really send you to jail for a long time.
Yeah, sure.
And also, really, I think it was Dennis. Dennis gets very heated when you talk about this because he was the one, I think,
who figured it out.
Yeah, but Terence claimed to, and Terence was the one who had the public platform to evangelize on their behalf and just proselytize on behalf of this weird psychedelic religion that I think he, not intentionally but unintentionally, was trying to create this movement around not just psychedelics but psilocybin mushrooms in particular. And as a kind of corollary of that, the other thing I say that he did is that he tried to establish mushrooms as this kind of religious sacrament in the American underground. Obviously, he stole that idea from indigenous Americans, the Mazatec Indians, that famous Gordon Wasson article, Life magazine, which had a
1957
galvanizing effect on him. Terence was like 11 or something when that came out, and but those are the kind of two main things that I say Terence gave to the psychedelic underground and help germinate this kind of idea that we are now in the midst of experiencing. And the other thing that I claim that he gave is this magical thinking and this sort of the relevancy of the truth. He wasn't beyond just making shit up. I have it on really good authority that much of Food of the Gods is probably his second best book after True Hallucinations, and which is really a wonderful read and really interesting in a lot of ways. He just made it up because he thought it would sell well among his constituents, and it did. And he, so Terence was just that kind of guy, and like a brilliant dude, but mixed with kind of delusion. Like he walked that tightrope between kind of brilliance and just bullshit, basically.
Yeah, the trickster, as they used to call Leary, and then everybody started calling him.
And it just seems to be part and parcel of the psychedelic movement. You know, this kind of again, this tightrope between like actual science and the opposite, pseudoscience.
Yeah, totally. Well, it's certainly the case in the marijuana literature and what people have written about cannabis. There's so much bullshit, drives me insane.
Yeah.
But again, it had this big impact, and I'd be really surprised if nobody else had figured out how to grow mushrooms. But who knows? And of course, there weren't. Terence wasn't the only one talking about. I mean, this is the whole thing with psychedelics, that it was this way to kind of, commune with greater things and so forth. But he certainly made a big. Had a major role in keeping these ideas alive in the 70s and 80s when, after the downfall of Leary and so forth, a lot of this stuff really went underground. Now we're finding out that it wasn't as underground as we thought. There's a recent book by Chris Elcock on psychedelic New York, and he talks about how there was a lot of stuff still going on in the 70s people just kind of forgot about because they're really obsessed with like the Bay Area as the center. And actually there was all sorts of stuff going on in New York from the very beginning, and it's still going on in the 70s. But, these major figures who get out there and do the publicizing, and he certainly, as you point out in the book, there's a million YouTube videos of him giving speeches on the lecture circuit in the 80s or in the 90s. They have a huge role. They play a giant role in this stuff, And so, and as I've asked in other places, like sometimes, and I'll talk to your students about today, sometimes you have to wonder if the truth really matters as much as whoever makes the argument that people want to hear.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's funny too, is like just in terms of like revisionist history, like it's now coming out. This wasn't really written about very much, but, for obvious reasons, again, the legality, but not long after Terence sort of claimed to have figured out how to cultivate magic mushrooms, there all these amateur mycologists like Paul Stamets came along and said, well, actually, if you know how to look for them, they're right in our backyard. He tells this famous story of having, I think, the largest flush of psychedelic mushrooms he found in like a field across the street from the story, across the street from a police station in like Bend, Oregon or something like that in the 1970s. And they were new species or unidentified species because nobody knew how to look for them. So that was also coalescing around the psychedelic kind of people who were into that stuff. And Terence and Paul were tied in. So it's all a bit diffuse, in a way, but it's still it's an interesting moment in time that is just now, I think, starting to, well, it has been for a while, but just starting to maybe get the kind of ink that it deserves. But not all of it good.
Right. All right, man.
All right.
That was awesome. Good job.
Yeah, that was great.
Yeah.
Sorry about the muscle spasm.
All right, there you go. Now you know all about us. You know the dirty secrets from when John and I were in high school. Back in the day, back in the late 80s. I guess we told some stories there. We didn't. They weren't the most reckless of the stories. There were more reckless ones we could have told. He mentions some of the recklessness in the book, and some of the stuff we did was just dangerous. It really was dangerous, and I'm glad my kids aren't mixed up in the same kind of danger that we were, though they're mixed up in their own kind of danger. Social media, phones, video games. But I always try to comfort my wife when we're both kind of wringing our hands about what's going to happen to our kids with all this crap. I say, well, look at me and John. We came out okay, right? I guess. Depends on your perspective. Anyway, speaking of social media, make sure to check us out on Instagram, YouTube, maybe other platforms soon. Like, subscribe to our feeds, and keep listening. I got some great shows coming up for you. Probably another episode here in the next couple of weeks with Emily Dufton, who also has a great new book coming out. And in fact, I am going to be featuring excerpts from both of these books, both John's book and Emily's book, on the newsletter. So check those out if you want to get a taste of the writing. Check out the History on Drugs newsletter on Substack. It's easy to find. Just use that Google machine. All right. Well, until next time, stay safe. Just stay safe. What else can I say at this point? Stay safe, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.